Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Strong, a hospitalist and a clinical associate professor at Stanford University. From the video title, you know I'll be talking today about the COVID vaccines in order to discuss some myths and misconceptions. As a physician who has been on the front lines treating acutely ill COVID patients since the beginning of the pandemic, it's it's been truly surreal seeing an explosion of anti-vax and vaccine hesitant sentiment this year. In some ways, it seems baffling when not only have more than 500,000 Americans died from COVID, COVID has disrupted our lives and economy to a degree that hasn't happened since World War II. But in other ways, this phenomenon seems totally predictable. First, everything COVID related, from masks to school closures and to the infection fatality rate, has been politicized. This isn't totally new. After all, AIDS was very political, particularly over early on. But I don't think a disease has ever been this politicized, where professing a specific belief in a disease fatality rate is seen as a political statement. In addition to the politics, most people spent far more time at home in 2020 than ever before, seeking ways to stay connected to other people. So naturally, they turned to social media, where it's cliche to point out misinformation abounds. This toxic synergy of COVID politics and online misinformation didn't form out of nowhere, but rather both evolved and were superimposed on a background of general skepticism of science and the government that has been percolating and slowly growing for decades. And the final ingredient, what was that spark that made vaccine hesitancy such a catastrophe this year? A tiny group of hardcore anti vax zealots who saw the situation as an opportunity to win converts, increase their visibility and followers, and to make themselves, an historically fringe group, finally feel relevant. What I've seen this year is normal, otherwise very rational individuals decide they don't want to receive a safe and effective vaccine for a potentially deadly disease that's still infecting tens of thousands of Americans each day. The typical person who's declining a COVID vaccine, they don't identify as an anti vaxxer, but they nonetheless have adopted anti vax talking points, whether or not they realize it. There's a phenomenon in social psychology that people will start to believe false information just from hearing it over and over, even if they initially know that it's false. Knowing what the truth is the first time you hear it, it doesn't protect you from eventually believing lies if you get bombarded with it enough. The core anti-vaxxers know this, and they exploit it by just flooding the airwaves and flooding the internet with anti-vax nonsense on social media. A study from a few weeks ago found that almost two-thirds of the misinformation about COVID vaccines originated from just 12 influencers within the anti-vax movement, all of whom promote bizarre conspiracy theories that go far beyond the COVID vaccine. These charlatans, and they are charlatans, they've had a lifetime to hone their skills and sharpen their message, and they are now applying it at the most opportune time ever for anti-vax propaganda. And they don't even need to convince people that vaccines are definitely unsafe. All they need to do is raise just enough doubt that people start to question the experts and feel uncomfortable committing to any decision, including the decision to be vaccinated. So if you're here watching this video because you're hesitant or because you're skeptical about the vaccine, or you just don't know, you just want some questions answered, it's totally okay. I understand. Some of the anti-vax folks are doctors, and they know the vocabulary, and their message can be very convincing. But I'm here to dispel these myths and misconceptions, and sometimes they're flat out lies. On this YouTube channel, I've posted 4 previous videos discussing the COVID vaccines, starting from last July, and because of these, in response to these, I've received thousands of comments and messages. From all of those, I've picked the most common negative or skeptical comments, and I've placed them into 3 categories. First are the things that are technically true, but which are misrepresented to seem more sinister than reality. Second are the myths that initially sound plausible and which lots of very reasonable people are nervous about, but which are still nevertheless not true. And last are the conspiracy theories. I'll start with those things that are technically true. In order to keep the video length from getting too out of control, I'll try to spend no more than a minute or two on each one, but I'll put a ton of relevant links in the video description for anyone who wants to know more information or wants to know where the original data comes from or the references that I'm getting my information from. First, none of the COVID vaccines are FDA approved. So in the US, there are several paths to getting a new drug or vaccine to people outside of a clinical trial. The most common one is FDA approval, in which a committee of experts reviews clinical trial data, often at least 2 separate trials, and who meets multiple times over many months to decide whether or not the available scientific evidence shows that the drug or vaccine is safe and that it's effective for its intended use over a significant period of time. A second path is emergency use authorization, which is pretty similar, except it typically uses just one clinical trial to establish efficacy, and the meetings of the committee to discuss the new medication or vaccine happen across shorter time intervals. However, that single trial still needs to be a robust, well-conducted, large, randomized controlled trial. For the COVID vaccine trials, tens of thousands of people were enrolled in each one. That's 10 times as large as typical clinical trials for routine medications that you may take every day without a worry. Overall, an emergency use authorization takes weeks, whereas approval takes months at least, sometimes even years. When you're in the middle of a pandemic, and literally thousands of people are dying each day, of course it makes sense to expedite the process of making a vaccine available. Why would you not do that? Being granted emergency use authorization status does not mean that research or monitoring stops. And COVID vaccines are not the first interventions to be granted EUA status. The point of the process was to make treatments available quickly in the setting of public health emergencies, like a pandemic. But there are still many layers of safety involved. This is not an experimental vaccine, as anti-vaxxers like to claim. The next technically true statement: vaccine manufacturers are protected against lawsuits. When people state this, the intention is usually to imply that pharmaceutical companies don't need to care if their product is safe because they can't be sued if it's not. But context here is important. The reason that vaccine manufacturers can't be sued far predates COVID. The idea goes back to the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, signed into law by Ronald Reagan, which was designed to protect vaccine manufacturers from financial liability related to vaccine injury claims. It also set up the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which allows victims of vaccine injury to receive compensation directly from the federal government. The reason this law was necessary was because of unjustified lawsuits in which parents and their lawyers claimed that a specific vaccine led to brain damage in children. And even though scientists and physicians repeatedly testified in court that the evidence showed no such link, the lawsuit still came, and it became a big enough problem that companies, they stopped producing the vaccine altogether. Producing a vaccine with that much liability, even if the liability was unjustified, was just not a financially sound thing for a private company to do. So, short of nationalizing vaccine production, the only way the US could get these vaccines produced and prevent the same problem from happening with other vaccines was to provide protection for the pharmaceutical companies. But true victims of vaccine injury, proven in court, still got compensated then, and they still get compensated now. It's just that it's the government that pays directly, not the company. With the COVID vaccines, the more relevant law is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, signed into law by George W. Bush in 2005. This means that COVID vaccine injuries get covered by something different. They get covered by the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program rather than the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. There is legitimate debate about whether the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program is as robust or fair as the other. That's getting a little bit into the weeds, but there is debate there. But the underlying principle is still the same. The government pays for vaccine injuries rather than the pharma companies because otherwise vaccines would not be profitable enough for farm companies to produce because of unjustified lawsuits. And the last technically true statement I'll talk about today: you can still get COVID even after the vaccine. Of course you can. No vaccine is 100% effective. No medication is 100% effective. But you know what? You can still be injured in a car crash if you're wearing a seatbelt. You can still die in a house fire despite a working smoke detector. You can get a woman pregnant or become pregnant yourself despite a condom. You can still develop lung cancer. Even if you quit smoking, you can still have a heart attack despite exercising regularly and eating a healthy diet. The notion that because the vaccine isn't 100% protective, we should instead opt for 0% protection is profoundly illogical. And yet, this is not some one-off opinion. This is something I've repeatedly heard. And I just wonder, do these people who say this, who have this approach to why they're not taking the vaccine, do they wear seatbelts and motorcycle helmets? Do they have working smoke detectors in their house? I don't know, maybe they don't. But having such an absence of any understanding of probability makes me wonder how these people are able to live independently. If they are unable to make decisions that mitigate personal risk in any way, I would have assumed that they would die an early death from some risky and deliberate omission of an obvious safety measure. Since they haven't died, and they're still here to criticize the vaccine, it sort of makes me think that just maybe this statement about skipping the vaccine because they could get COVID anyway is because they don't want the vaccine for other reasons, like political beliefs or peer pressure, but they can't say that out loud. And so they're looking for another excuse, even a ridiculous one. Now we get to the reasonable myths, things that are not true, but over which I understand why people are concerned. And I'm going to start with the big one. The COVID vaccines have not been studied for long enough. Or in other words, the vaccines were too rushed. When developing a new med or new vaccine, there's a standard sequence of events. Basic science research that occurs before human trials, which may include animal research, as it did in this case, despite occasional claims to the contrary, followed by 3 phases of trials of increasing size and duration. If it's found to be unsafe at any point, the med or vaccine does not continue along the path. Normally, the pretrial basic science research can last years, and there can be gaps between the phases of human trials to be sure that all the data has been fully analyzed and understood before even starting the next step. But the actual final phase 3 trials, the ones that are used to gain FDA approval, they don't necessarily last years and years. They last only as long as necessary to demonstrate benefit or lack thereof. So if a particular med is expected to take 5 years to show statistically significant benefit over placebo, the trial will follow patients for 5 years. And if another med is expected to show significant benefit within 1 month, that may be as long as patients are followed for. So when it comes to prior vaccines for other diseases, where vaccine development took 5 to 10 years, those 5 to 10 years were not because phase 3 trial participants were being followed for that long to ensure they didn't develop some random side effect a decade later. The majority of those 5 to 10 years were pre-trial research. When it comes to COVID, we started off with a reasonably good understanding of it because of the microbiological similarities to the SARS virus, also a coronavirus. And our technology has improved with an accelerating rate. So we didn't need years and years to determine its structure or its genome or the proper protein target for a vaccine. The time between the discovery of SARS-CoV-2, that's the virus that causes COVID, and its genomic sequencing was only a few weeks. And it's rumored that the time between when the genome was provided to scientists at Moderna and when they had a working prototype of the vaccine was only days. This is where the overwhelming majority of time of development was saved, in addition to overlapping the 3 phases of the clinical trials rather than doing them sequentially. Another reason that prior vaccines took longer was that during the clinical trials, researchers had to wait for a minimum number of events, that is, infections in this case, before being able to determine if there was a benefit from the vaccine. Since we're in the midst of a pandemic, we didn't need to wait very long for enough infections in the unvaccinated group to make the benefit of the vaccine apparent. In past vaccine trials that were much longer because the diseases they protected were less common, toxicities and side effects were all apparent after the first 6 to 8 weeks. Directly observing patients for years afterwards as part of a multi-year trial has never shown the existence of any delayed side effects for any vaccine. So in short, the time course for developing the COVID vaccines were so short because we've gotten much better at research, because we already knew a lot about the biology of coronaviruses before COVID came along, and because COVID is so prevalent that it only required a few months of the phase 3 trials to demonstrate overwhelming benefit from vaccination. And then, in addition to that, let's not forget that the development of COVID vaccine received funding and global attention that has been unprecedented in all of human history. The speed of vaccine development was no shorter than it should have been, and instead of the speed being indicative of some of government recklessness or some government conspiracy, we should be celebrating it as a victory for science and for international cooperation. The vaccines don't stop transmission or asymptomatic infection. The source of this myth is, ironically, scientists' desire to speak as precisely as possible. From the start, everyone knew that it would be easier and quicker to demonstrate that a vaccine reduced symptomatic infection than it would to demonstrate reduced asymptomatic infection or reduced transmission. It's a logistically far easier question to answer in a clinical trial. So when the initial phase 3 trials of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines came out, showing just that, a reduction in symptomatic COVID, reporters and politicians and the public all asked the scientists, but does the vaccine reduce transmission? And the scientists answered as honestly as they could by replying, we don't know, there isn't evidence of that yet, but we believe it likely does. There isn't evidence yet that it reduces transmission got translated to there isn't evidence, which further got translated by the anti-vax crowd to it does not reduce transmission. This myth would never exist if scientists and physicians portrayed their hypotheses and educated guesses as fact. That's what most non-scientists seem to do when asked about something on the TV or the internet. But scientists don't roll like that. If something is 98% likely, they don't say it's definitely the case. They say it's highly probable, but we don't know for certain. However, having said all that, the additional months that have since passed since those phase 3 trials in December, they've given us multiple sources of data that do show vaccines prevent asymptomatic infection and do prevent transmission. Links will be in the video description. So if you're thinking that you're young and healthy and are personally at low risk of death from COVID, your vaccination will still benefit everyone else around you. Related to that myth is the one that young people don't need the vaccine because their risk of death from COVID is low. This myth has gotten new attention after a version of it was voiced by a former mixed martial arts fighter, podcaster, and not a physician, Joe Rogan. But as I said, young persons who get immunized are much less likely to infect others, who could be their grandparents, their neighbors, their coworkers, or someone just standing next to them in line at the grocery store. Using your own youth and health as an excuse to not get vaccinated is not okay. Plus, outcomes from a COVID infection are not a binary full recovery versus death. Many young persons who are infected and who ultimately survive, they still end up in the hospital or the ICU. They can be sick for weeks. They can miss weeks of work or school. And they can be left chronically debilitated with lung fibrosis, strokes, chronic fatigue, and cognitive problems. Death is not the only outcome of COVID that should worry you. The vaccines cause infertility. Infertility is an emotional issue, and fear of the vaccine causing infertility is one which the anti-vax crowd was all too happy to exploit. But there is absolutely zero scientific basis to this claim. None whatsoever. Vaccine scientists are not at all worried about this. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, in other words, all the experts who are most concerned with preserving a person's fertility, they have released a joint statement entitled medical experts continue to assert that COVID vaccines do not impact fertility. There are baby parts in the vaccines. What this is referring to is the use of fetal cell lines in producing some of the vaccines. A fetal cell line is made up of the descendants of a cell that was originally taken from a fetus decades ago, which have since reproduced in a lab over and over again thousands of times. So vaccines that use fetal cell lines, like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, do not contain fetal tissue or actual fetal cells any more than an Impossible Burger, artificial meat grown from tissue cultures, contain actual beef. And no new or recent fetuses are used in this process in any way. For example, the J&J vaccine uses the PER-C6 cell line, which is derived from a single cell taken from elective abortion in 1985. Now, I understand that abortion is an emotionally charged subject, and reasonable people can still feel like this connection, as distant as it may seem to some, is still more than they would feel comfortable with. So the good news is that neither the Pfizer nor the Moderna vaccines use any fetal cell lines in their production. So if a strongly pro-life philosophy is the reason you have avoided the vaccine, you can take either the Pfizer or Moderna ones without worrying about compromising principles. And the last reasonable myth: people should only care about their own vaccination status. It's no one else's business whether I get vaccinated. So there are a couple problems here. First, as mentioned already, no vaccine is 100% effective. Second, when unvaccinated individuals catch COVID, somewhere around 20% will end up in the hospital using resources that are getting diverted from other people. But the big problem, the one that many don't realize, but is actually the biggest one, is that the longer the pandemic goes on for, and the greater number of transmissions and infections, the greater the chance that a mutation will occur that will allow the virus to evade immunity provided by the vaccine. So in other words, if the virus circulates too long among all the unvaccinated individuals, it could eventually evolve into a different strain that can then infect vaccinated individuals. This is why the whole world should be worried about what's happening in India right now. The exponential growth of cases there is a risk to all of us, just like a huge segment of the population not getting vaccinated is a risk to all the vaccinated individuals. Okay, now we get to the conspiracy theories. These are the beliefs that are very easily disproven, contradict high school level biology, or in some cases are just plain absurd. COVID is no worse than the flu, so why bother to vaccinate? First of all, even if that was remotely true, which it is not, doctors do recommend getting annual flu vaccines too. But more to the point, seasonal influenza doesn't kill remotely close to 500,000 Americans in a single 12-month period. I know that government reported statistics can seem abstract and can seem ripe for being fudged for political purposes. So if you're skeptical about the numbers, just talk to a doctor or nurse who worked in a hospital during this past winter. I've worked on an internal medicine unit throughout the pandemic, and I've never seen anything remotely like what we saw in December and January. Entire wards of our hospital were filled with nothing but COVID. We reorganized the wards. We recruited extra healthcare professionals. The call and coverage systems were changed, all to accommodate the huge excess of patients. And our hospital was not even remotely the worst affected in California, let alone the worst affected in the country. Someone in DC cooking the numbers for some nebulous and nefarious gain, they can't manufacture a physical crisis like that. You can't fake a hospital being full of acutely ill patients. And you don't need to take my word for it. Find someone who worked in the hospital this past winter, or just go online and watch reporters taking tours of COVID units and speaking with the staff there. COVID is not just like the flu. Thousands of people have died from the vaccine. So this myth, or conspiracy theory as I think it's more appropriately labeled, comes from the fact that thousands of deaths have been reported to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. But a death being reported as a possible vaccine complication does not at all mean that they were a complication. First of all, anyone can report a vaccine complication. They don't actually need to be the person's physician. They could be just anyone remotely aware of what happened. But in addition to that, as of now, over 140 million Americans have received at least one dose of the COVID vaccine. By chance alone, thousands, if not tens of thousands of them, will die within weeks after receiving the vaccine for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the vaccine. One of the ways that the CDC monitors for vaccine side effects after authorization is to look to see if certain conditions are reported more commonly to the reporting system than would be expected from chance alone. This only works if doctors and others report any possible complication. So, for example, maybe there have been 100 reported strokes within a week of vaccination. The CDC would look at that number and try to see if it was higher than would be expected based on the rate of strokes in the general population during non-COVID times. But a conspiracy theorist, they would just look at the numbers out of context and say, aha, the vaccine has caused 100 strokes. I myself have reported a post-vaccine death through the reporting system because the individual developed a rare condition in the weeks after vaccination. I'm certainly not convinced it was from the vaccine, but I, as an individual, cannot be sure of that. People like vaccine experts and epidemiologists at the CDC, they need to look at all the data and crunch all the numbers to see if there are any signals of toxicity. While the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines have so far not been linked to any fatal outcomes in a cause and effect relationship, there has been a recent development with the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines. A tiny number of recipients have developed a syndrome called thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, in which they have blood clots, low platelet counts, and they develop an abnormal blood test, something called PF4 antibodies. The number of patients affected is truly tiny. The problem was initially identified when there were only 6 cases in the US, though the CDC has since identified several more, which is out of 7 million J&J recipients. However, this condition is otherwise rare enough in the general population that even this really small number, it might eventually turn out to be enough evidence that this is a real, very serious vaccine complication. But even then, only 1 American is believed to have died because of it. That's 1 out of 7 million. It's obviously tragic for that individual and for their loved ones. But if we stopped all medical interventions that have a risk of death of 1 in 7 million, there would be no antibiotics. There would be no surgeries. In fact, there would be no procedures of any kind. We wouldn't even have most over-the-counter medications. This doesn't mean that it's not important. For example, since all the identified cases occurred in women under the age of 65, some experts are suggesting that women under 65 should preferentially receive the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, which have not been associated with this problem. And keep in mind that the fact that such a tiny number of people were identified and are being investigated is evidence of the vaccine reporting system working as it should. But the bottom line here is that thousands of Americans have not been killed by COVID vaccines. Meanwhile, during the 4 months that have elapsed since the first vaccines were authorized, COVID the disease has killed well over 100,000 Americans. Doctors are promoting the vaccines because they are shills for the pharmaceutical industry. Financial conflicts of interest for physicians have historically been a huge concern for some medications, particularly expensive medications for chronic illnesses. But aside from the fact that this problem is much better than it was a generation ago, it makes no sense to invoke it with the COVID vaccines. First, the vast majority of Americans who have been vaccinated at dedicated vaccination sites run by local governments or large healthcare systems. In most parts of the country, individual doctors aren't personally ordering or administering the vaccine like they would a medication. Where I work, I would not even be able to vaccinate my own patients. Second, even in places where doctors are personally ordering the vaccine, the profit margin on the vaccines is too small for there to be kickbacks involved. These vaccines are orders of magnitude cheaper and are just one-time medications or one-time administrations compared to the chronic medications that were concerns in years past. And last, up until now, there's been far greater demand for the vaccine than supply. There's no need for a pharmaceutical company to pay off doctors to sell a product that they already can't produce fast enough. mRNA vaccines are not vaccines, but rather gene therapy and/or they alter your DNA. I know it sounds weird to inject RNA from something else into your body, but when you catch COVID, or any virus for that matter, including the common cold, the virus literally inserts its entire genome into millions of your cells. On the other hand, these vaccines include just a tiny part of the COVID virus's genome, one gene only, the one for the COVID spike protein. And the RNA does not get converted into DNA. It does not get inserted into your own genome. Neither our cells nor the vaccine has the necessary machinery, that is, the necessary enzymes that would allow this to happen or enable this to happen. The vaccine RNA hangs around just long enough for our cells to make the COVID spike protein that would trigger an immune response and antibody production. And then the RNA is degraded by the same process that degrades our own RNA, over a span of hours to maybe a day or two. In fact, by the time our immune system is responding to the spike protein, the RNA from the vaccine is already mostly degraded. And none of this has anything to do with gene therapies. Since the vaccine contains patented genetic material, if you receive it, part of you is now owned by the pharmaceutical company. I wonder, does this mean that when people have an artificial joint or heart valve implanted, they are partly owned by the medical device company that built those parts? Or since the RNA from the vaccine is fleeting, maybe a better analogy would be if I drink a Coca-Cola, am I partly owned by the Coca-Cola company? The amusing part about this conspiracy theory is that it was actually a minor plot line from the sci-fi television show Orphan Black, but it's just fiction. And last, the vaccine contains nanobots and or microchips to track us. This claim is so ridiculous, yet so common, I don't know if the people who post comments like this are serious or are just trolling. Ignoring the fact that humanity doesn't have remotely close to this level of technology, even if we did, it would be ludicrously expensive to inject it into every American. But even ignoring that, even just putting that aside, the government is already tracking you irrespective of whether or not you get vaccinated. Cell phones, license plate cameras, CCTV, logging your IP address with every web search, credit card purchases. There is nothing that injecting you with a billion-dollar tracking device will tell the US government that you don't already willingly share with them. So that's all I've got for today. I hope I've been successful at alleviating the fears of at least a few vaccine-hesitant individuals. As I said at the beginning, it's totally okay and understandable to have concerns and questions, especially when the internet has been deliberately flooded with misinformation.